the Biden administration is committed to this agenda of climate change, but even the amount of resources that it was prepared to devote to climate change was I think disappointing. So if it was disappointing under Biden, it's going to be worse under Trump.
Olá, Canal Brasil está aqui em Washington, na sede da Organização dos Estados Americanos. É o Canal Brasil, uma realização FECOM São Paulo. Nós recebemos hoje Michael Schitter, do Diálogo Interamericano. Mr. Schitter, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay. Mr. Schitter, let me ask you a curious question regarding the concept of America's backyard. When this sentence was created, it meant warning for European powers to not come back to America. And the word backyard meant close proximity between the United States and these newly independent countries like Brazil. But with the passing of time, there was a perception in Latin America that expression America's backyard would mean some kind of new colonial intentions of the U.S. toward Latin America. What is the history of this concept, Latin America as America's backyard, and what it meant it has a meaning today?
Well, thank you. I think the concept is extremely, the term is extremely unfortunate. And is used even by, I hear it, senators and members of Congress, even those who are most sympathetic and understanding and supportive of Latin America. I don't think they don't fully understand how it's perceived and how it's received in the region. And it's I think, a very disparaging, pejorative term that shows that the region is the strategic prerogative of the United States, which of course it's not. I'm not sure it ever was. It is backyard also indicates geographic proximity, which of course is true. But I think it goes beyond that, and it shows that the United States can do whatever it wants in its backyard. And that, I think, is extremely unfortunate, and I think we should hopefully one day discard and dismiss that term altogether. It has been not helpful at all in what are already very difficult relations, so we don't need that term to make things worse. But I think that's, unfortunately, it's acquired that meaning today. And every time I hear someone say it, I tell them that they should jettison it because it's not helpful. It doesn't describe reality, certainly doesn't indicate where things are going. That reality, if it ever existed, no longer exists.
There's another perception in Latin America that the region is losing its importance, relative importance to the U.S. Foreign policy. Is it true? Latin America in the last 10, 15 years has been losing relative importance for the foreign policy of the United States?
Well, I would say two things. First of all, we always have to break down the region. The region is not all the same. It's very differentiated. And I think there's difference between Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean versus South America. Colombia may be an exception because of Plan Colombia, where the U.S. Has paid a lot of attention and has been engaged. But I think there has been a decline, notably in this century. The 21st century is one where I think there's been a drifting apart, a distancing between the United States and Latin America generally. And this really happened because, beginning with George W. Bush, at the end of Bill Clinton, but really with George W. Bush, with 9/11, and the response to 9/11, the wars first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, where all the attention, resources were directed there. And I remember being in Washington when Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, arrived here, and there was great enthusiasm 5 days before 9/11. And there was a sense you could get an immigration agreement, there could be progress between the two governors, former Governor Bush and former Governor Fox. And then 6 days later, everything changed. And I think since that time, there really hasn't been any serious effort to try to sort of recapture that. And of course, beginning this century really is when you see China becoming much more engaged with the region and through finance and trade, and then eventually more investment, which is where we are now. And of course, China is not only in South America, but is throughout the whole region. And the United States today is consumed by the wars in Europe and the Middle East, and of course hasn't been able to really focus much on the region. So it's kind of an afterthought.
So it's because of the right reasons, because there's instability perceived by the United States in other regions of the world, that Latin America became less of an issue.
That's correct. That's correct. There's a sense that there is a lot more strategically at stake for the United States in other parts of the world. And there's just so much bandwidth, there's so much that they could do is limited. And so I think President Biden in one interview almost acknowledged as much openly when the presidents of Chile and other countries said, you know, Mr. President, we don't see the United States much down here anymore. And he said, you know, I know. He says, that's unfortunate, but I can't help it. I have to look, you know, I have to deal with Ukraine and now the Middle East, and I just can't, you know, give it the attention. I care about Latin America. I like Latin America. And Joe Biden does have a lot of background in Latin America as when he was in the Senate and then as vice president. But he just has been unable to do very much. And so there are lower level officials that kind of manage things and react to things and try to sort of keep things together. But there's no initiative and there's no influence.
Donald Trump was elected for a second term as a president, and he appointed Marco Rubio as the next chief of the Department of State. And he has, of course, Latin American background, personally speaking. Can we expect some kind of different kind of approach of the United States with Latin America in the Trump administration, or it's just a name and things will keep going as they are?
I think there will be a difference with Marco Rubio because, as you say, he has extensive contacts, background, knowledge of the region. He's been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee, but it's certainly anybody who thinks that Latin America is going to become a priority, I think, is mistaken. He's going to have to demonstrate that he is a serious foreign policy diplomat by really dealing with three issues: the war in Ukraine that he'll inherit, the Middle East mess, which he'll inherit, and of course the global competition with China, where he has been a hawk, a very strong position on China. And I think he's going to have to balance that with what he cares about, which is Latin America. And so I don't think it will be a priority, but it also won't be what I call the afterthought that it usually is. The afterthought meaning, well, we do with everything else, and okay, well, let's have a summit on Latin America too. I think it will get a little bit more attention from a Marco Rubio than we've seen from, you know, Blinken or from, you know, Rex Tillerson or other secretaries of state in recent years. And I think that will mean a more of an ideological approach. I think some, especially regarding sort of leftist governments in the region, but Trump will control policy towards Mexico. I don't think Rubio will. I mean, that's where he wants to focus. I don't think Trump is going to be interested much in South America. The only exception there is Venezuela, where I think Trump will be interested. And I think we could see an interesting development and an interesting change in U.S. policy towards Venezuela, because I think what Trump did in his first term was a complete failure, the maximum pressure, and I think Trump realizes that. And he may have a different approach towards Nicolas Maduro, similar to his approach to other strongmen throughout the world, which is, trying to make a deal with them. That is a possibility. We'll see what happens, but I think Marco Rubio also has been very anti-Maduro, but I think there we may see a difference between the Secretary of State and the president.
There's this rising competition between the United States and China in global terms. Donald Trump promised during the campaign to increase taxes for everybody, but it's a kind of another trade war with China that was announced. I think that was 60% that was announced as tariffs against China. What Latin America in this confrontation between the United States, because China is a very important trade partner with almost all, if not all, South American and Latin America countries. Can this U.S. pressure made Latin America one of the battlegrounds between influence between China and China is the greatest commercial partner of Brazil since 2009, and the United States is the second one. Latin America could be a battleground between these two big powers.
I think that's certainly very possible. I mean, it was in the first Trump administration. I think most Latin American governments are very pragmatic. They realize they're in bad economic straits, facing very difficult challenges economically, and they want to get the benefits they can get from China and with the United States and from the United States. So they want to deal with both. And I think there's increasing concern in Washington, and I think we'll see it, especially in the Trump administration, of Latin American countries through various projects getting a little bit too close to China. And I would expect pressure to increase. This could be through tariffs, it could be through other tools that the United States has on certain countries. And I think many countries are very concerned about that, worried about that can come. And I think it could be a battleground. It's not the ideological battleground that it was during the first Cold War, but there is an economic battleground. And the problem continues to be that the United States is just not offering a very viable and attractive alternative to China. And I don't think, and I think that we've seen this in the Biden, even the first Trump administration tried to develop these programs. There's something called the Development Finance Corporation. There was a program called America Crece. And now in the Biden administration, there has been the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. But if you really analyze it carefully, it just doesn't compete. It really is not a very serious alternative. Countries like it because they can get something, but they can get a lot more from China.
What's the role of Brazil, and what can we anticipate from the relations between Brazil with President Lula in power and the second term of President Donald Trump? Do you think that Brazil, you mentioned some kind of a possible ideological turn in the American foreign policy, but Lula has been very pragmatic in its foreign policy. So, do you anticipate any kind of?
I think it will be. I think it will be kind of a status quo. I don't see it really heating up, because Marco Rubio doesn't like that Lula is from the left, and doesn't like that he hasn't been tougher with Maduro and he hasn't been tougher on the Cuban government. I mean, we know that. But, Marco Rubio will be in a new role and will have new responsibilities. It's different being the top diplomat of a country and being a senator from Florida. And I think we're going to see, he's not going to be able to just deal with his soulmates in Latin America, Javier Milei and Nayib Bukele. That Secretary of State can't do that. And Brazil is the giant, and is obviously he's going to have to deal with Lula, and I think we'll see a lot of more pragmatism from Marco Rubio with the Lula government. I don't think there's going to be great efforts to deepen a strategic partnership with Brazil. But on the same hand, I think there will be an effort to keep things on track and to keep things smooth in the relationship, to the extent that there are going to be problems. There always have been problems. The U.S.-Brazil relationship has never been very easy or without some issues. So we can expect that, but I don't think it's going to be derailed. I don't think there'll be a major crisis. I don't think Trump will really focus very much on Brazil. I think his focus, his priority is Mexico, because Mexico is where we have immigration, we have trade, we have security, we have drugs, and we have China. Those are the 5 big issues for Donald Trump, and that's where he's going to set his sights.
Yeah, it was one of the major themes of the election, the theme of immigration. So we should expect something big in the relation between the United States and Mexico, maybe other Central America or Caribbean countries too.
Well, I think with Mexico, I am a little concerned about Guatemala, which is the biggest Central American country, which has a president, Bernardo Revelo, who was elected, and he's had a tough time governing. He's gotten a lot of support, both financial, economic support, as well as political support from the Biden administration. I'm not sure whether that will continue. And he's already in a very shaky position because he is the subject of a lot of persecution and by the judiciary and by other entrenched, very powerful interests in Guatemala. And I think there are major questions about how the Trump administration will deal with him, even though he certainly couldn't be considered somebody from the left. But the Guatemalan, some elite groups in Guatemala see him as somebody from the left because he's anti-corruption and because he's pro-reform, and they don't want to fight corruption and they don't want reform because they have a stake in the system. So there could be issues there. I think with Nayib Bukele, there will be complete support in El Salvador. With Daniel Ortega, there may be efforts to kind of squeeze him a little bit. Maybe a tough position on Honduras that's moved to the left, and clearly very much with China and anti-U.S. So
And Venezuela.
well, on Venezuela, again, I think it's possible that we'll go back to where we were, and there'll be a deja vu with Guaido too, with Maria Corina Machado, and go back to maximum pressure. All options are on the table. Increased sanctions. We remember that movie, but that movie didn't have a happy ending.
Yes.
Because Maduro is
Still there.
and some people argue that he's more powerful than ever. So I think Trump, maybe not Rubio, but Trump would be tempted to pursue a different course of seeing whether he could make a deal with this strong man. He likes to make deals with strong men. And the only reason he had that policy, let's be very clear, in his first term was not because he had a huge commitment to democracy in Venezuela. It was because of Florida and Florida politics. And he wanted to win, he had to win Florida in 2020. He won Florida. He didn't win the election, but he won Florida. And that was in my judgment, that was what motivated him, was not because of, he stayed up at night worrying about how do we get democracy in Venezuela. He's not worried about democracy anywhere else in the world. Why would he worry about it in Venezuela? But he was worried about getting elected, and he's worried about his own personal agenda. And now I think Florida doesn't figure as importantly. He doesn't care much about that. And he cares about his personal agenda. I think he sees opportunities in the oil sector where he could benefit, his friends could benefit. There are a lot of very wealthy people from Texas and elsewhere that are very interested in Venezuela and how they could profit from that. And I think he may be looking at a migration deal. It's very hard to deport people back to a country where you don't have an agreement.
Yes.
And there are no relations. And so now Maduro would have to give Trump something in return. So Trump could say, I got a good deal, but not necessarily focus on getting rid of Maduro, as he tried to do in his first term.
Talking about the world as a whole, and this, it's China the big issue for this government, because it was in the first term of Donald Trump, as president, there was some kinds of changes. This historical relationship between the United States and Europe took there were hard times for these relations. Do you expect that a second wave of this kind of foreign policy, or we should not expect this? China, but another kind of relations with other regions as Europe, as the idea of a pivot to Asia from the Obama administration.
Yeah.
What should they expect from the United States in the second term of President Trump?
Well, I think we saw a little bit of a preview in the first term, and I think China is the overriding issue. I don't think the Trump administration is going to pull out of NATO, for example. I don't see that, but he clearly is not going to be very engaged or very committed to it. He'll let the arrangements continue, but he's not going to be very close as Biden was towards the European allies. And so I think there is a focus on, there is a bipartisan consensus about China.
Yes.
I mean, that's the one thing that there is some consensus about in Washington. China brings both parties together, even though the Republican Party, I think, has a different, more hardball, what we call hardball tactics here, and as opposed to the Biden administration. So we could see that intensify those kind of pressures on China. And I think building some alliances in the sort of the Asia Pacific is something that I think Trump would be very interested in doing. So I think Europe has already been preparing for a second Trump administration
Yes.
for a long time. So that's kind of the way I see it, evolving, that China will be the focus. I think he's going to try to end the war in Ukraine. I think the Europeans may not be happy with that, but I think, he's not going to pull out of NATO, I don't think. I think he'll just let it kind of go, but not give it a lot of resources. And we'll still continue to scold the Europeans for not contributing more, not putting up more money. And even though it's gotten better, their contributions have increased, but he'll still continue to use that because that works for him politically, to scold the Europeans.
Talking about the new polarization of the politics in Latin America, you have both sides of the political spectrum with leaders that are a bit out of the moderate weight of government. I'm talking about from the right you have Milei Bukele, from the left you have Maduro, Ortega. It's this kind of impressions of the political extremists in various, including in Brazil. It was including a guy who tries to explode the Supreme Court of Brazil some weeks ago. This kind of political instability is the new hallmark of Latin America.
Well, it's been a hallmark for
The world.
yeah. A, it's been a hallmark for the world, and B, it's been a hallmark for Latin America and other times as well. This isn't totally new. I mean, there have been times that it's been a little bit more tranquilo, and other times it gets a little bit more agitated and more unstable. And now we're living through one of those times. I mean, what we can say is that the region has never been more fragmented. And I think there was some hope, maybe a false hope or a hope without any basis or wishful thinking, that when President Lula, was recently, had his, in 2023, came back, that he could provide some leadership and try to have some measure of integration in at least in South America. But, that's very, very difficult, obviously. And so I don't see it coming from any other leader. If it doesn't come from Lula, it's not going to come from anybody. That hasn't happened. I don't see it's going to happen in the coming years. I mean, that would be what one would hope for as a way to kind of respond to some of these seismic shifts that we're seeing happening globally, and for Latin America to become less marginal and more relevant than it is today. But it's hard to identify where that would come from in today's Latin America.
A big issue for Latin America leaders and countries is the climate change and the way to try to respond to it. With the election of President Trump, who is not a a fan of the trying to accelerate a change and the energetic change in the world. Can you expect some difficulties for the region to try? Next year will be the 30th climate
Right.
change meeting summit in the world. Can we see some more difficulties for the region to become a leader because there will be not a partner in the United States for this kind of change and
It's
policy?
clearly going to be a very difficult environment. It already is difficult, frankly, and I'm not sure the Biden administration is committed to this agenda of climate change, but even the amount of resources that it was prepared to devote to climate change was I think disappointing. So if it was disappointing under Biden, it's going to be worse under Trump, and he's not going to be interested at all and think that it's a waste of money and a waste of energy. And without the United States on board with this agenda, it's very difficult. Doesn't mean you can't make progress, but if the country's if the world's greatest superpower and leading carbon emission most responsible country, most responsible, and the country with the most resources and capacity to try to reverse this trend is not interested. It's an uphill battle. Doesn't mean people will give up on the battle, and I think President Lula will continue to do what he's done, and other leaders as well. But it's going to be extremely frustrating. I think that's the reality.
The inter-American dialogue is dealing with Latin American issues for decades now. Latin America has a problem. There is not only poverty but inequality. The inequality is a social issue. That's one of the main issues for a social frustration and unbalance in society. What this new wave or new technologies? What are the main exits for this issue in Latin America? I don't know if the dialogue is trying to reach out to try to point some kinds of way out of this kind of society fractured by the inequality.
Mm-hmm. Well, the biggest program of the dialogue, both probably in terms of resources and staff, has been education. The dialogue's been working on that. It's probably the major organization, certainly in Washington, outside of the banks, the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, that works on education, and but works on it in a political sense that you have to get mobilized support for giving this issue much more attention than it's gotten. And Latin America, frankly, is way behind because of low productivity and not competitive. And this is the issue. And you take a country like Mexico, this is the problem. I mean, it's not as long as it doesn't have an educated workforce that could really compete in the 21st century, it's just going to fall behind. So I think education has been a high priority of the dialogue. I wish I could say there's been a lot of progress in the last 30 years. Clearly, there's more awareness of how important it is.
Mm-hmm.
There's been some business groups and associations have shown a greater commitment to the issue and understanding that if they don't help support, greater education, that the region is just going to suffer and their own businesses are going to suffer. But there aren't enough enlightened, business people that look in the long term. And of course, for politicians, there's no short-term benefit because education takes a long time.
Yes.
So if you're going to be serious about it, you're going to have to. You're not going to be able to benefit from it in the 4 years that you're in office. So it's very hard to have the incentives in place for politicians to give it this seriousness. But certainly, education has been at the top of the agenda of the Inter-American dialogue from the beginning.
Thank you very much for your interview. It was a pleasure to have you with us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.